Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Before I share this story with you, I want to express my debt of gratitude to my husband, Cantor Andy, who brought this story to my attention, and for the reporting of Greg Garber from ESPN and Scott Petoniak of the Rochester Sentinel. Doug Goodwin was still groggy from his heart transplant surgery. As he looked at the horrific scenes unfolding on his television in the recovery room at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in Upper Manhattan, he thought for sure he was watching a science fiction movie. It wasn't until a few hours into his recovery that the reserve fullback from the Buffalo Bills AFL title teams in the 1960s learned that the smoke billowing from the World Trade Center and the terrified people stampeding down the streets away from the collapsing skyscrapers was the work of terrorists, not some master of special effects. One of the doctors sat down by my bed and explained to me that this wasn't some Godzilla movie, Goodwin said. He told me what happened, and I was stunned. I couldn't believe that all this had occurred while they were operating on me. Years after the attacks of 9/11, Goodwin still had a tough time believing and processing the surreal nature of that day. He continued to wonder why his life was saved at the same moment nearly 3,000 lives were lost at Ground Zero, a scant 5 miles south of Columbia Presbyterian. "I definitely experienced a miracle," said Goodwin. "It's like God sent angels to get that heart to me in the nick of time. If it had arrived just a little later, I wouldn't be talking to you now." So many things had to go right that day to help Douglas MacArthur Goodwin, known to his friends, family, and teammates as Big Mackie. And one of the things that went right was the moral and financial support Goodwin received from his big-hearted cardiologist and his former teammates. Dr. Ulrich Jordi, the late Bills quarterback and United States Representative and candidate for Vice President of the United States, Mr. Jack Kemp, and the late owner of the Buffalo Bills, Ralph Wilson, all dug deep into their own pockets to help Big Mackie pay the exorbitant post-operation medical and prescription drug bills that his insurance company would not cover. "They all stepped up big time, especially Mr. Wilson," Goodwin said. "Those bills would have wiped me out. But my bills, my old teammates, were there for me in a time of need, and I'll always be grateful to them." A timeline of that day. At 6:30 a.m., the donor heart was explanted from the donor at a Boston hospital, suspended in a preservation solution, wrapped in plastic, and nestled in a bed of ice. The heart's shelf life, 4 hours, 5 at the outside. When the doctors who were sent to pick up the heart returned to Logan Airport in Boston, they were stopped by security. They were told the ambulance couldn't proceed to the tarmac and the awaiting plane without an escort. "They wanted all this paperwork, all these things," one of the doctors remembered. "I explained the situation. I said, I have a heart that's in the ambulance. I gave him my name and credentials, and they waved me on." At 7:40 a.m., the pilot started the twin engines and began the long taxi from the north terminal to the runway. At the exact same time, 2 Boeing 767s ultimately bound for New York, American Flight 11 and United Airlines Flight 175, both scheduled to arrive in Los Angeles, were making final preparations for departure. The pilot Herman, said, "American Airlines is not too far from the North Terminal. We taxied right close enough to the 2 767s, one of which was being pushed back at the time. I even remarked to my co-pilot, 'Isn't that a gorgeous airplane?'" Later, Dr. Ulrich Jordi remarked, "In 2 of those planes, you have people determined to kill thousands of people, to commit acts of absolute terror. And in the other plane, you have 2 surgeons trying to rush this heart home to save one life. See, I set before you this day life and prosperity, death and adversity. I command you to love the eternal, to walk in God's ways and keep God's mitzvot, laws and rules, that you may thrive and increase, and that the eternal may bless you in the land that you are about to enter. But if your heart turns away and you give no heed, are lured into the worship and service of other gods, I declare to you this day that you shall certainly perish. You shall not long endure on the soil that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life if you and your children would like to live, by loving the eternal, heeding God's commands, and holding fast to God. For thereby you shall have a life and endure upon the soil that God swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give to them. The little plane took off at 7:50 a.m. 9 minutes later, American Flight 11 followed. Another 15 minutes later, United Flight 175 had cleared Logan. At 8:35 a.m., the doctors touched down at Teterboro in New Jersey. It was one of the last planes allowed to land there that morning. The new heart was loaded into an ambulance and set off for Columbia Presbyterian. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Dr. Yoshifumi Naka began the process of taking out Big Mackey's mechanical heart, which had resulted in him being hospitalized for 7 previous months. At 8:46 a.m., American Flight 11 slammed into the World Trade Center's North Tower. At 9:03, United Flight 175 hit the South Tower. 12 minutes later, the ambulance reached the George Washington Bridge. The doctors saw the dark cloud rising above the World Trade Center, turned on the radio, and learned for the first time that the towers were under attack. At 9:21 a.m., 3 minutes after the ambulance crossed the bridge. 3 minutes after the ambulance crossed the bridge. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey ordered all bridges and tunnels closed. Later, we found out we were one of the last vehicles to cross the bridge before they shut it down, one of the doctors said. It was really close. At 10:05 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. 23 minutes later, the North Tower followed. By 3 p.m., Dr. Naka had closed Goodwin's chest. The operation, based on early returns, had been a success. Later that afternoon, Dr. Yordi visited the sleeping Goodwin. Seeing Doug after his transplant in the ICU on a breathing machine still under anesthesia, I thought, he has no idea what happened. How are we going to tell him? On September 12th, nearly 30 hours after he had been first anesthetized, Big Mackey awoke in his 6th-floor room at noon, feeling better than he had felt in more than a decade. Dr. Peter Shapiro, a psychiatrist at Columbia Pres, assured him that everything was real, though absolutely surreal. And so, in retrospect, is the entire saga of Doug Goodwin. The doctors, the pilot, and the ambulance drivers that successfully harvested the heart and brought it home were merely doing their job. Clearly, they had a sense of urgency about them, but no more than usual. What if the donor heart had been available even minutes later? What if the terrorists, Yamach Shemam, may their names be blotted out, had struck minutes earlier? If this heart had been held up at any point at the airport, before the bridge, not even being able to leave Boston, we don't know whether Doug would have survived. Said the late Jack Kemp about this episode, the word heartwarming is a metaphor, but it's a wonderful one. I am so conscious of the donor, the doctors, the nurses, the hospital, my teammates, the Bills, Mr. Wilson. I think it's one of the greatest stories of my life. There are a lot of memorable moments in my life, football games, politics, But this stands out because it saved a human being's life. Goodwin would get emotional when he would think about all of the things that had to align themselves for his transplant. When I saw how people came together for this 9/11 thing, it brings tears to your eyes, he said. When I see how the world came together for something like this, then you understand how beautiful life is, that the world has a heart. The world has a big heart. Goodwin's new heart gave him a new lease on life. A few weeks after his surgery, he resumed coaching football and track at Holy Trinity High School in Hicksville, Long Island, and traveled to Boston College to watch his son, Doug Jr., play football for the Golden Eagles. That time was so poignant for Doug Sr. because his days with his own father had been cut short by a fatal heart attack suffered during Goodwin's junior year at Maryland State in 1963. I felt a little cheated my dad didn't get to see me play pro ball, but I feel so blessed that I got to see my boy play college ball. Big Mackie's life with his new heart extended all the way to June 2019. He passed away last year at the age of 77. On a day when too many chose death, these people, these loving, dedicated, extraordinary people, chose life. May we follow that example, always, if we and our children and our children's children may have a beautiful life on this glorious earth. Shabbat Shalom.